They left an alien widow and her child to rot in a cage. But when the station's systems falter during a plasma storm, Glenn seizes his chance. With a black market override key, he unlocks the cage door, freeing Sierra and Leary. As alarms blare and guards approach, Glenn launches them toward safety in an escape pod, sacrificing his own security to delay pursuit. The Shard's Edge station hung in the void like a cracked jewel, its once gleaming surfaces dulled by decades of neglect. In the so-called quarantine wing, a designation that had long since lost its meaning, the corridors stretched in endless, labyrinthine patterns, their bulkheads webbed with ice crystals that sparkled under the station's faltering lights. Glenn Mallory's boots made a hollow sound against the metal flooring as he stepped off the mag-rail transport. A systems analyst by trade and temperament, Glenn lived his life by numbers, protocols, and paperwork. His thin frame and perpetually furrowed brow gave him the appearance of someone constantly calculating, which, in truth, he was. Today's calculations concerned a discrepancy in the station's ration logs, a minor issue by most standards. But in Glenn's world of precise data, even small anomalies demanded investigation. Ration allocation exceeds reported occupancy by 0.38%, he muttered to himself, eyes fixed on his datapad. Third consecutive quarter. The statistics were clear, but the explanation was not. On paper, this wing housed nobody. It had been decommissioned years ago when the Empire reorganized its detention protocols. Yet, somehow, food was disappearing into its shadows. Glenn's fingers, pale and quick, swiped through screen after screen of data, station specs, maintenance logs, personnel assignments. Each document was a carefully constructed reality that matched every other document, except for those strange ghost entries in the commissary database. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed such discrepancies. Last year, during the Call 4 audit, he'd seen corpses misfiled as discharged. He'd said nothing then. Bureaucratic error, he'd told himself. Not his department. The corridor ahead flickered, lights dimming momentarily before surging back to life. A subtle tremor ran through the hull, so faint that anyone less attuned to the station's rhythms might have missed it. Glenn paused, head tilted. Something else lingered beneath the ambient hum of machinery, something unmechanical, organic, alive. He hesitated. Datapad clutched to his chest like a shield. The sound came again, fractured, piercing, painfully beautiful. A child's cry. Nobody was supposed to be here. Nobody was supposed to hear this. For a moment, Glenn considered logging it as an audio system malfunction and returning to his quarters. But the cry came again, and something in its fragile beauty pulled him forward, down the rust-stained corridor, away from the well-traveled paths. The passage narrowed, ceiling panels sagging where condensation had warped them over years of neglect. Ice crystals glittered on the walls, forming delicate patterns like frozen coral. Glenn's breath fogged before him as the temperature dropped. The life support systems here were clearly operating at minimal capacity, enough to prevent pipes from freezing, but not enough for comfort. When he found the cage, Glenn's first thought was that he was looking at a storage unit. Corroded freight grading bars patched with strips of insulation formed a crude enclosure in what had once been a maintenance bay. Only, when he stepped closer, did he see the torn piece of plastel, a child's drawing, crude lines depicting two figures standing beneath a star. And inside the cage, huddled together on a thin mattress, were two figures whose skin was a pale jade green, their eyes rimmed with silver halos. The woman was gaunt, her long limbs folded around the small form of her daughter. Neither moved as Glenn approached, but the child's eyes followed him, wide and luminous. Glenn fumbled for his diagnostics beacon, a reflexive gesture, as though he could scan them for errors, debug whatever situation had placed them here. The beacon's soft blue light pulsed in his hand. To his surprise, the child raised her tiny hand and tapped her fingertip in perfect rhythm with the light. Tap, tap, tap. An unspoken pact of recognition passed between them. They were both sentient beings. They both understood pattern and response. In that moment, Glenn knew he could not simply file a report and walk away. "I'm Glenn," he said quietly, lowering himself to a crouch to appear less threatening. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes flickered, but she remained silent. The child stared, silver-rimmed eyes unblinking. "Do you understand me?" Glenn tried again. No response. Glenn pulled his datapad from his pocket and ran a quick search on the species database. The jade skin and silver-haloed eyes matched descriptions of the Aran people, a race known for their complex vocal communication and artistic traditions. But the Empire had classified them as non-compliant after border disputes in the Outer Reach. Many had been detained. Most, according to official records, had been processed and repatriated. "Processed," Glenn whispered. The Empire's euphemisms suddenly felt like blades. He stood, tucking the datapad away. "I'll come back," he promised, though he wasn't sure they understood. The child's hand lifted again in that same tapping motion. Glenn mimicked it before turning to leave, already calculating the risk of what he was considering. The station's night cycle brought a simulated darkness to most corridors. But in the abandoned wing, little changed, except the distant sounds of off-duty personnel, which faded to nothing. Glenn returned with a bundle tucked beneath his jacket. Unauthorized rations, thermal strips, a small light cube, and a packet of cleansing wipes. No patrols challenged him. This area wasn't worth monitoring. The woman was awake this time, sitting cross-legged on the mattress with her daughter sleeping against her chest. When Glenn approached, she moved one protective arm more tightly around the child. "I brought food," Glenn said, keeping his voice low. He placed the items on the floor and slid them carefully through a gap between the bars. "And heat." The woman stared at him, expressionless, but her eyes held a wariness born of hard experience. Slowly, she reached for the thermal strip, activating it with a practiced touch. As warmth spread through the small space, the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. "What's your name?" Glenn asked, though he didn't expect an answer. To his surprise, the woman's lips moved, forming a sound so soft it was barely audible. "Sira." Glenn nodded, encouraging. "And her?" He gestured to the sleeping child. "Leary." The word seemed to cost Sira great effort, as though speaking aloud was painful or forbidden. "How long have you been here, Sira?" She looked away, and Glenn understood that some questions cut too deep. Instead, he activated the light cube, adjusting its glow to a soft amber that cast gentle shadows around the cramped space. In its warm light, he could see faint markings on Sira's arms, intricate patterns that might have been tattoos or natural pigmentation. The database had mentioned that Arans were known for their body art, each pattern telling a story or denoting a role in their society. Glenn returned each night, bringing small comforts: a better blanket, nutrition packs, medicine for Leary's cough. Each visit revealed more of their story through fragments of conversation. Sira had been a voice keeper in her community, a preserver of oral history and song. Her husband, a trade negotiator, had died in the initial conflicts with the Empire. Sira and Leary had been detained during a refugee transport interception, classified as security concerns due to Sira's cultural knowledge, and then simply forgotten. Leary, who had known little but the cage, began to anticipate Glenn's visits. She would tap out little patterns against the floor or the walls, fragments of lullabies her mother had taught her. Sometimes, Sira would whisper words in her own language, sounds that seemed almost human, but carried tones beyond Glenn's hearing range. As their trust grew, so did Glenn's inner turmoil. Each night when he returned to his assigned quarters, he stared at the ceiling, remembering the corpses from Call 4. How many others had he failed to notice? How many had died because people like him filed reports and asked no questions? The turning point came 3 weeks into their clandestine relationship. Station systems reported a plasma storm approaching, a natural phenomenon that would disrupt communications and divert surveillance drones for emergency monitoring. Glenn recognized the opportunity immediately. With most security personnel occupied with storm preparations, this might be their only chance. "I can get you out," he told Sirah that night, voice urgent. "Tomorrow, during the storm response, there's an escape pod bay that's still functional." Sirah's expression remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around Leary's small hand. "Why?" she asked. Glenn hesitated. "Because it's wrong. What they did to you. What I didn't do before." The admission felt both insufficient and enormous. Sirah studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. It was enough. The following day, as the station shuddered under the first waves of the plasma storm, Glenn made his final preparations. He'd spent his savings on a one-time override key, a black market purchase that would unlock any door on the station exactly once. He'd falsified maintenance orders to clear their escape route. He'd programmed the pod for an automated descent to New Ara, a frontier colony where Imperial presence was minimal, and a contact named Nin had agreed to provide shelter. When the corridor lights flickered out, replaced by the red glow of emergency illumination, Glenn knew it was time. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the cage one last time. Sirah and Leary stood ready, their few possessions bundled in a makeshift sack. The override key hummed against his palm as he pressed it to the lock. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed deafening in the silence, the cage door swung open. Sirah stepped out first, barefoot and wary, scanning the corridor with the instincts of prey long hunted. Leary followed, her small hand clutching her mother's. Glenn gestured urgently toward a service tunnel that would bypass the main corridors. "This way," he whispered. "Quickly." They moved in silence, Glenn leading, Sirah carrying Leary when the child's steps faltered. The service tunnel was cramped and cold, maintenance ducts crowding them from above, while coolant pipes lined the walls. Glenn's datapad provided the only light, its blue glow casting their shadows in strange, elongated forms across the metal surfaces. A distant alarm sounded. Not for them, Glenn hoped, but for some storm-related system failure. They froze, listening. Footsteps approached, echoing from a connecting passage. Glenn motioned for Sirah and Leary to press themselves into a shallow alcove while he continued forward, hoping to draw attention away if necessary. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices, a security patrol responding to the alarm. Glenn held his breath as they passed the junction ahead, mere meters from where he stood. One guard paused, frowning, his head turning toward the service tunnel. "What is it?" another asked. "Thought I heard something." Glenn's hand moved to his pocket, fingers closing around his station ID. If discovered, he would claim to be conducting emergency maintenance. It might buy Sirah and Leary enough time to reach the pod bay without him. But the guard shrugged after a moment. "Just the storm playing tricks. Come on." As their footsteps faded, Glenn released his breath and motioned for Sirah and Leary to continue. The pod bay was close now, a small auxiliary launch facility used primarily for supply deliveries to the planet's surface. According to station logs, all personnel had been reassigned from this section during the storm. The bay doors slid open at Glenn's approach, revealing a single escape pod nestled in its launch cradle. Designed for emergency evacuations, it would be cramped for 2 passengers but serviceable. Glenn hurried to the control panel and began the launch sequence, fingers flying over the keypad. "You need to hurry," he told Sirah as the pod's hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss. "The launch will trigger alarms, but by the time they respond, you'll be in the atmosphere." Sierra hesitated at the pod's entrance, Leary clinging to her side. "You're not coming?" Glenn shook his head. "Someone needs to delay the pursuit. I've programmed the coordinates for Nin's location. She'll meet you at the landing site." He pressed a small communicator into Sierra's hand. "When you're safe, send a signal, just one tap." "They'll punish you," Sierra said, her silver haloed eyes reflecting the pod's interior lights. "Maybe," Glenn acknowledged, "but they'll have to find me first." He managed a small smile. "I know this station's hiding places now." Leary stepped forward suddenly, her small arms wrapping around Glenn's waist in a fierce embrace. It was the first time she had touched him, and the gesture nearly undid his resolve. He knelt, returning the hug gently. "Be brave," he whispered. "Both of you." As Sierra and Leary settled into the pod, Glenn completed the launch sequence. Warning lights flashed across the control panel, the station's systems registering the unauthorized activation. Soon, security would be alerted. Glenn had minutes, perhaps seconds. "Ready?" he asked. Sierra nodded, one arm protectively around Leary. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it, "for hearing us." The pod sealed with a definitive click. Glenn stepped back as the launch sequence completed, watching through the viewport as the small vessel detached from its cradle and dropped away from the station, engines igniting in a brief, bright flare before it disappeared into the swirling plasma clouds surrounding the planet. Alarms blared throughout the bay. Glenn took a deep breath, then turned and ran in the opposite direction from their escape route, hoping to lead any pursuers away from their trajectory. He would hide in the station's abandoned sectors, moving between maintenance tunnels and decommissioned storage areas until it was safe to establish contact with New Aura. The pod's descent was violent, buffeted by atmospheric winds and the lingering effects of the plasma storm. Inside, Sierra held Leary tightly against her chest, murmuring ancient prayers in their native tongue as the vessel shuddered and groaned around them. The autopilot fought to maintain their course, thrusters firing in erratic bursts that sent them spinning through cloud layers before stabilizing again. New Aura grew larger in the viewport, a patchwork landscape of rugged mountains and sprawling plains dotted with the geometric shapes of colony structures. Their landing site was on the outskirts of a settlement, amid the ruins of an abandoned industrial zone where the pod's arrival might go unnoticed among the scattered debris. The final descent was rough, the pod's landing struts absorbing most of the impact but still jarring enough to knock the air from Sierra's lungs. For a moment after they settled, neither moved, adjusting to the sudden stillness and the sound of actual wind against the hull, a planet's breath after years of recycled station air. "Are we safe?" Leary whispered, her first words since their escape began. Sierra touched her daughter's cheek. "We will see." The pod's hatch released with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Warm, dust-laden air rushed in, carrying scents that were almost overwhelming after the sterile environment of their cage. Soil and vegetation, metal oxidizing in the sun, distant cooking fires. Sierra helped Leary out first, then followed, their bare feet touching planetary soil for the first time in 3 years. They stood in a landscape of rust and renewal. The abandoned industrial zone was a graveyard of half-collapsed structures and discarded machinery. But native flora had already begun to reclaim the spaces between. Violet-tinged vines climbed the skeletal remains of loading cranes. Strange, bulbous growths that might have been fungi or flowers erupted from pools of stagnant water. Following Glenn's instructions, they made their way toward the settlement, staying close to the ruins for cover. Leary stumbled often, unused to the natural terrain and the planet's gravity, but her eyes were wide with wonder at each new discovery. A 6-winged insect hovering above an iridescent puddle, the texture of crumbling concrete beneath her fingers, the way sunlight filtered through clouds in visible beams. The settlement appeared gradually, first as smoke rising from distant chimneys, then as scattered dwellings on the periphery of the industrial zone. Most were constructed from salvaged materials, shipping containers retrofitted with windows, hull plating repurposed as roofing, cargo netting serving as garden trellises. It was a community built by those with little, making use of whatever they could find. Nin's flower stall was exactly where Glenn had said it would be, at the junction where the main settlement road met the path from the ruins. It was a humble structure, little more than a lean-to, sheltering rows of potted plants, with blossoms in impossible shades of blue and gold. The florist herself stood behind her wares, a tall woman with spiral markings tattooed around her eyes. Another Erin, though her jade skin had been weathered to a deeper hue by New Era's sun. She showed no surprise when Sira and Leary appeared at the edge of her stall, merely nodded once and gestured for them to follow her through a narrow alley behind the shop. Her dwelling was small, but clean, its walls lined with drying herbs and flowering vines that seemed to pulse gently in the filtered light. "You're Glenn's friends," Nin said as she closed the door behind them. It wasn't a question. "He sent word that you might come." "He helped us escape," Sira confirmed, her voice still rough from disuse. Nin nodded, her expression softening as she looked at Leary. "The child needs food and proper clothing. You both do." She moved to a storage unit and began retrieving items. Simple garments, containers of preserved food, a pair of soft-soled shoes that might fit Leary's small feet. "You can stay here until we find you a more permanent place. There's a community of our people in the Eastern Quarter. Many escaped detention during the last Imperial withdrawal." Sira accepted the offerings with quiet dignity. "We are grateful." "Save your gratitude for your friend," Nin replied. "Few humans would risk themselves for our kind." That night, after Leary had fallen asleep on a pallet in the corner, Sira sat beside the dwelling's single window, the communicator Glenn had given her cradled in her palm. She activated it with a touch, waited for the connection indicator to stabilize, then tapped once against its surface. Tap. Somewhere on the Shard's Edge station, a matching device would have received that signal. Somewhere, Glenn would know they had survived. The days that followed were an adjustment for both Sira and Leary. Freedom, Sira discovered, came with its own challenges. After years of confinement, she found open spaces disorienting. The settlement's market square, with its crowds and noise, often sent her retreating to Nin's quiet dwelling, heart racing, breath shallow. The abundance of choices, what to eat, when to sleep, where to walk, was overwhelming after so long having no choices at all. Leary adapted more quickly. Children, Sira reflected, were resilient in ways adults could not match. Within a week, her daughter was playing with other children in the dusty streets, learning their games, mimicking their accents. She still woke sometimes in the night, crying out from nightmares of the cage, but each morning brought new discoveries that pushed those memories further away. They sent regular signals to Glenn, 1 tap for safety, 2 for danger, though thankfully the latter was never necessary. Sometimes he would respond with brief text messages, updates on his situation. He had avoided capture during the initial search, but remained hidden in the station's unmapped sectors, surviving on stockpiled rations and careful movement between hiding places. Imperial investigators had questioned all systems personnel, but found no conclusive evidence linking anyone to the escape. Weeks passed. Sira began working in Nin's flower stall, learning the names and properties of New Ara's botanical offerings. Her knowledge of Erin traditional medicine proved valuable. Soon, customers sought her out specifically for herbal remedies and advice. Leary attended informal lessons with other refugee children, taught by elders in the Eastern Quarter, who preserved their cultural knowledge despite displacement. Then, 3 months after their escape, the communicator displayed a new message. Coming. 3 days. Glenn arrived as he had promised, aboard a supply transport that delivered agricultural equipment to the settlement twice yearly. Sira spotted him in the market square, moving uncertainly through the crowd, his station-pale skin marked by new lines of worry. She watched him for a moment before approaching, suddenly unsure. They had known each other only briefly, under circumstances that distorted normal relationships. What would he be to them now? What would they be to him? But when Leary saw him, she ran without hesitation, weaving through the crowd with the confidence of a child who now knew her world. Glenn knelt to meet her, his thin face transforming with a smile that erased all Sira's doubts. "You came," she said when she reached them, her voice steady now after months of renewed speech. Glenn stood, Leary's hand clasped in his. "I promised I would." They walked together through the settlement, Leary between them, chattering about her new friends, her lessons, the 6-winged insects she had learned to catch and release. Glenn listened with evident delight, his gaze occasionally meeting Sira's, over their daughter's head, shared recognition of the miracle that was Leary's recovery, her capacity for joy despite all that had been taken from her. Nin had helped Sira secure a small dwelling of their own, a converted storage unit at the settlement's edge with a view of the distant mountains. Its courtyard was a work in progress, the hard-packed earth softened by containers of flowering plants and a small vegetable garden. Inside was sparse but comfortable, sleeping pallets, a cooking area, shelves lined with Sira's growing collection of botanical specimens. "It's not much," Sira said as they entered, suddenly seeing the space through new eyes. "It's perfect," Glenn replied, and she could tell he meant it. After the sterile confines of the station, this humble dwelling with its mismatched furnishings and living plants must have seemed like luxury. That evening, as Leary slept, Sira and Glenn sat in the courtyard beneath a sky painted with the sunset colors of a world neither had expected to share. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the small sounds of the settlement winding down for the night. Distant conversations, the clatter of cooking implements, someone playing a stringed instrument several dwellings away. "How did you escape?" Sira finally asked. Glenn's smile was rueful. "I know the station better than they do. After the initial search failed, they assumed I'd left on another transport. By the time they realized I was still hiding somewhere on board, the trail was cold." He paused. "I resigned officially, sent in the paperwork through normal channels, citing personal reasons. No one questioned it. And they won't look for you here. New Aura is outside their priority zones now. Too little strategic value. Too much local resistance." His gaze moved to the dwelling's entrance, where Leary slept beyond. "Besides, I'm officially just another failed bureaucrat who couldn't handle the pressure. Not worth the resources to track down." Sira nodded, understanding the calculation. The Empire's cruelty was systemic rather than personal. Once individuals fell outside its immediate interest, they were simply forgotten. The same administrative neglect that had condemned her and Leary to the cage now granted them a measure of safety. "What will you do now?" she asked. Glenn looked thoughtful. "I have some savings. Enough to start something small. There's a plot of land for sale beyond the ridge." He gestured toward the shadowed hills, visible on the horizon. "Nin says it gets good sunlight, has a natural spring. Could be a farm, maybe, or a nursery for those medicinal plants you're studying." "You would stay?" Sira couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "If you'll have me," Glenn said quietly. "If there's a place for me here, with you and Leary." Sira's hand found his in the gathering darkness. "There is." The next morning, they painted 3 flowers on the courtyard wall, violet blooms representing Sira, Leary, and Glenn. It was an errand tradition, Sira explained as they worked, to mark a dwelling as a home by depicting its inhabitants in symbolic form. Leary added her own embellishments, spiral patterns reminiscent of Nin's tattoos around each blossom, connecting lines that linked the 3 flowers together. "A family," she declared, satisfied with her work. Glenn's eyes met Sira's over their daughter's head. Yes, he agreed softly. A family. They purchased the land beyond the ridge, a modest 5 acres with rocky soil that would challenge even experienced farmers. But the view was unparalleled. Rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains, a small stream cutting through the property, and, on clear days, the faint shimmer of New Ara's twin moons visible even in daylight. They named it Sparrow's Ridge, after a tiny bird-like creature that nested in the crags above their land. Building their homestead was slow work. Glenn's analytical mind proved valuable in designing irrigation systems and structural supports, while Sira's knowledge of plants helped them determine what would grow in the difficult soil. They started with a greenhouse constructed from salvaged station panels and polyplast sheeting, then added a small dwelling built into the hillside for natural insulation. Local neighbors, a mix of human colonists and alien refugees, helped with the heavier construction, a community barn raising that ended with shared meals under the stars. Leary attended a small school in the nearby settlement, returning each day with new knowledge and endless questions. She showed a particular aptitude for languages, switching effortlessly between the colony's common tongue and the musical Aran language Sira was teaching her. At night, she would often ask Glenn to tell her stories of Earth, a planet she had never seen but imagined as a paradise of endless oceans and green forests. 5 years passed in this way, marked by the steady rhythms of planting and harvest, school sessions and market days. The homestead expanded, a second greenhouse, a workshop where Glenn repaired colony equipment, a meditation garden where Sira practiced the vocal traditions of her people. Their lives, once constrained by walls and protocol, now flowed with the seasons and the needs of their land. News of the empire reached them occasionally: policy changes, border disputes, personnel reassignments. None of it seemed to touch their remote corner of New Ara, though Sira and Glenn remained cautious. They maintained connections with the refugee network, ready to move if necessary. But as the years passed, the urgency of that contingency plan faded. On the 5th anniversary of their escape, they held a small celebration at Sparrow's Ridge. Nin came, bringing exotic flower cuttings for Sira's garden. Several families from the eastern quarter joined them, children running through the tall grasses while adults shared food and quiet conversation. As the twin moons rose, casting their silver light across the property, Leary, now 10 and tall for her age, performed a traditional Aran dance among the violet flowers that had become the homestead's signature crop. Sira and Glenn stood together at the edge of the gathering, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. They had both changed in the years since the station. Glenn's frame had filled out from physical labor, his once pale skin now weathered by New Ara's sun. Sira's silver-haloed eyes had lost their haunted look, replaced by a quiet confidence. But some things remained the same: the gentle way Glenn listened when others spoke, the careful precision with which Sira tended her plants, the bond that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" Sira asked softly. "Leaving everything behind?" Glenn watched Leary twirl among the flowers, her movements graceful and uninhibited, the antithesis of the silent, frightened child he had first seen in the cage. "Never," he answered truthfully. "Not for a moment." Later, after the guests had departed and Leary had fallen asleep, they sat on the homestead's porch, watching the night sky. The stars were different here than they had been from the station viewports, warmer somehow, less distant. Somewhere among them, the Shard's edge continued its orbit, its quarantine wing perhaps housing new forgotten souls, or perhaps standing empty, a monument to systematic cruelty. "I still hear it sometimes," Sira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The silence of that place, the cold." Glenn took her hand. "I know, but then I hear her." Sira nodded toward their dwelling, where Leary slept, laughing, singing, living. And I remember that we are here because one human heard a child crying and chose to listen. Glenn squeezed her hand gently. It was the only choice that mattered. They sat together as the night deepened, surrounded by the subtle sounds of their homestead, wind rustling through greenhouse panels, nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush, the gentle bubbling of the stream that nourished their land. The scars of their past remained, etched into memory, as surely as the silver halos around Sierra's eyes, or the calluses on Glenn's once soft hands. But here, beneath New Ara's twin moons, they had found what the Empire's protocols and paperwork could never provide, a home defined not by walls, but by love. And in the morning, they would rise together to face whatever the day might bring, secure in the knowledge that they had already survived the worst the universe could offer, and found each other in the process. As spring returned to Sparrow's Ridge, the homestead bloomed with new life and possibility. The greenhouses overflowed with medicinal plants, their aromatic leaves and colorful blossoms drawing customers from distant settlements. Glenn's workshop hummed with activity as he repaired colony equipment and designed irrigation improvements that helped neighboring farms flourish. Leary, growing taller each day, divided her time between school, helping with a harvest, and exploring the ridge with friends from nearby homesteads. Their family had expanded in unexpected ways. 2 younger Aran children, siblings, orphaned during a transport accident, had come to live with them the previous winter. Mila and Tav, ages 7 and 5, had initially been temporary guests through the refugee placement network. But as weeks turned to months, it became clear that Sparrow's Ridge had room in both its dwellings and its heart for more children who needed a home. Sierra found particular joy in teaching the children her people's traditions. In the evenings, they would gather in the meditation garden where she led them in vocal exercises that encompassed the full range of Aran expression, sounds that resonated beyond human hearing, but created patterns of harmony that could be felt as much as heard. Leary had become quite accomplished. Her young voice, capable of producing the complex overtones that characterized traditional Aran music. The younger children were still learning, but their enthusiasm compensated for their lack of technique. Glenn often watched these sessions from a respectful distance, aware that he could never fully participate in this aspect of their cultural heritage. But he found his own ways to contribute, documenting the traditions in writing, a practice Arans had historically avoided, building instruments that complemented their vocal ranges, creating spaces where their culture could flourish, away from imperial suppression. "You're preserving something important," he told Sierra one evening, as they watched the children practice a traditional greeting song. "Not just for them, but for everyone." Sierra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "On Ara, I was just one voice keeper among many. Here," she gestured to the children, "here, every voice matters more because there are fewer to carry the songs forward." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from Glenn's communications console, a system he had built from salvaged components that allowed them to maintain contact with the refugee network while monitoring Imperial communications in their sector. Glenn excused himself to check the message, expecting routine updates about supply shipments or community gatherings. Instead, he found an encrypted alert that sent a chill through him despite the warm evening air. "Inspection incoming. Imperial verification team. 3 days." Sierra found him staring at the console, his posture tense in a way she hadn't seen since their early days on New Ara. "What is it?" she asked, immediately alert to the change in his demeanor. "Imperial inspectors," Glenn replied, voice low to avoid alarming the children. "Coming to verify colony compliance with new regulatory protocols. Here, to Sparrow's Ridge?" "No, to the main settlement. But they'll review population records, resource allocations." He turned to face her, concern evident in his eyes. "They'll be looking for discrepancies, like 3 unregistered Aran refugees living on a homestead, with a former Imperial Systems analyst." Sira absorbed this information with the calm practicality that had carried her through years of hardship. Do we run? It was a possibility they had prepared for, however remotely. There was an emergency cache buried beneath the workshop floor. Identichips with alternate personas. Coordinates for sanctuary settlements beyond Imperial jurisdiction. Enough portable currency to secure passage for all of them. Glenn considered the option, mentally calculating risks and probabilities as he once had with station data. Not yet, he decided. Running would confirm suspicion. There might be another way. They waited until the children were asleep before discussing options with Nin, who arrived at the homestead after receiving her own alert through the network. The three adults gathered around the kitchen table, speaking in hushed tones as they weighed their limited choices. The inspection team is small, Nin informed them, her spiral tattoos catching the lamplight as she leaned forward. 2 officials, standard compliance review. They're checking all frontier colonies in this sector, following reports of resource diversion. Do you have contacts in the settlement administration? Glenn asked. Someone who could temporarily alter the records. Nin shook her head. Too risky. Colonial databases sync with Imperial networks daily now. Any manipulation would be flagged immediately. What about hiding the children temporarily? Sira suggested, though her expression revealed how painful she found the idea. There are caves in the northern ridge. 3 days in caves with 3 children, Glenn said gently, including a 5-year-old who still has nightmares about dark spaces. They fell silent, each aware of the impossible calculation before them. Stay and risk discovery, potentially endangering not just themselves, but the entire refugee community that had sheltered them. Flee and abandon the home they had built, returning to lives of constant movement and uncertainty. What if, Nin said slowly, we made everything legitimate, retroactively? Glenn and Sira exchanged glances. How? Glenn asked. Colonial Provision 87C. Nin explained. Cultural Preservation Exception. It allows frontier settlements to petition for residency permits for non-humans who possess significant cultural knowledge of value to the historical record. As a former voice keeper, Sira would qualify. The provision exists, Glenn acknowledged, his analytical mind already searching for flaws in the proposal. But the petition process takes months, sometimes years. Not if sponsored by a recognized cultural institution, Nin countered. Which the new Aura Botanical Conservatory now is, as of last month's certification. She allowed herself a small smile. A certification I may have expedited in anticipation of increasing Imperial oversight. Hope flickered cautiously in Sira's expression. You could sponsor us? As valuable researchers documenting Aran botanical traditions and their applications in frontier medicine. Your greenhouse work would support the claim. Nin turned to Glenn. And you, as a former Imperial employee with an exemplary record, who chose to settle here after resignation. Nothing suspicious about that. Many former Imperial workers prefer frontier life after service. Glenn considered the proposal, mentally reviewing Imperial protocols as he had once memorized them. It's possible, he admitted, if we can process the documentation quickly enough. We start tonight, Nin said firmly. I brought the necessary forms. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. While maintaining normal routines for the children's sake, the adults worked through nights preparing their case. Glenn's knowledge of Imperial bureaucracy proved invaluable as they navigated the labyrinthine application process. Sira documented her botanical research, compiling years of notes on Aran medicinal traditions adapted for New Aura's native flora. Nin leveraged her position at the conservatory to expedite certification of their work as culturally significant. By the time the Imperial verification team landed at the main settlement, their petition had been submitted through official channels, creating a legitimate paper trail that predated the inspection. Glenn remained at Sparrow's Ridge with the children, while Sira and Nin went to present their research at the conservatory. a scheduled demonstration that coincidentally allowed the inspectors to verify their identities and status without a direct homestead visit. The strategy worked better than they had dared hope. The inspectors, more concerned with resource allocation than individual settlers, noted the recent petition and marked it for routine processing. Their presence in the settlement lasted barely 2 days before they departed for the next colony on their verification route, leaving no indication that Sparrow's Ridge had drawn particular attention. "We were lucky," Glenn acknowledged that evening as they celebrated with a small feast in the homestead's main room. The children, oblivious to the danger that had passed, played happily with new toys Nin had brought as research materials, traditional Aaron puzzle blocks that developed spatial reasoning skills. "Not just luck," Sira replied, watching Leary help Tav with a particularly challenging configuration. "Community, connection." Her hand found Glenn's under the table. "Family." Later, after the younger children had gone to bed, Leary joined the adults around the kitchen table, old enough now to be included in certain family discussions. At 12, she retained few conscious memories of the cage, but its legacy remained in small ways. Her discomfort with confined spaces, her habit of hoarding food when anxious, the intuitive tap code she still used with Glenn when words felt insufficient. "Are we safe now?" she asked, direct as always. The adults exchanged glances, weighing honesty against reassurance. It was Glenn who answered, respecting her enough to offer truth. "Safer," he said. "The petition gives us legal standing we didn't have before. But the Empire's policies change, and we should always be prepared." Leary nodded, accepting this reality, as she had accepted so many others. "But we're together," she said. It wasn't a question. "Always," Sira promised, reaching across the table to touch her daughter's cheek. "Whatever comes." That night, Glenn stood alone on the homestead's porch, watching the twin moons rise over the ridge that had given their home its name. The day's events had stirred memories he usually kept carefully contained. The hollow sound of his boots on station flooring, the blue pulse of his diagnostics beacon, the fractured beauty of a child's cry echoing down an abandoned corridor. He had been a different person then, rule-bound, risk-averse, complicit in his silence. The journey from that man to who he was now had been neither straight nor easy. There had been nightmares, moments of paralyzing doubt, the constant fear that his choice, however right, would lead to disaster for those he had come to love. But there had also been this: morning light streaming through greenhouse panels, Leary's laughter as she ran through fields of violet flowers, Sira's voice raised in songs that had nearly been lost to silence, Mila's serious face as she helped categorize plant specimens, Tav's small hand trustingly placed in his as they walked the property's boundaries. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by listening when it would have been easier to turn away. A soft sound behind him announced Sira's presence before her arms encircled his waist, her cheek resting against his shoulder blade. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the night deepen around their home. "What are you thinking about?" she finally asked. Glenn covered her hands with his own. "Everything that led us here. All the small choices that could have gone differently." Sira understood. They had discussed it many times over the years. The fragility of their shared path, the improbable sequence that had brought them together. "But they didn't," she reminded him. "You heard us. You came back. You opened the door." "And found everything that matters," Glenn finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, crops to tend, children to teach, the constant vigilance required of those who had once been forgotten by an empire that might someday remember them again. But tonight, beneath New Ara's twin moons, they allowed themselves to simply exist in the present moment. Two beings from different worlds who had found in each other something worth risking everything for. On Sparrow's Ridge, amid violet flowers and the soft sounds of a family at rest, They had created what the cage had tried to deny them, a future defined not by walls, but by possibility. And whatever storms might gather on distant horizons, they would face them as they had faced everything since that first moment of recognition, together, one day at a time, listening for the cries that others chose not to hear.